for the city of Forest Grove. And I'd like to welcome you all to this morning's presentation, Rules of the Road. This is the first of two programs that we're doing with WTA. We have one next week, and I'm going to post the link in the chat right now. And that's for the Oregon Friendly Driver class, and that's also at 10 o'clock. So we hope you can join us there. I'm actually going to hand this off to Maddie and Julia. Maddie's from the Street Trust and Julia from WTA, and they'll set the program up, talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing today, and introduce our guests. So Maddie.
Thank you, Bob. Hi, I'm Maddie Carlson from the Street Trust. My pronouns are she, her. The Street Trust advocates for multimodal transportation options that prioritize safety, accessibility, equity, and climate justice in the Portland metro region. We envision a complete, safe, low-carbon multimodal transportation system that contributes to equity and access, opportunity, health, and prosperity for people and communities across the Portland metro region and beyond. Today's legal clinic, which we host quite often, will be led by Cynthia Newton from Thomas Coon, Newton and Frost. But first, I'm going to pass it over to Julia Jones from the WTA.
Thanks, Maddie. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia. I work for Westside Transportation Alliance, or WTA, and we're a nonprofit here in Washington County. We work mostly with employers to create programs and rewards programs for their employees to help them get to work without driving alone. But we also want to make people feel empowered to try biking or carpooling or taking transit, even if they're not commuting to their workplace. So we're happy to be partnering with the Street Trust to bring you this class and next week's class. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Cynthia.
Thanks, Julia. Welcome, everyone. I'm really glad you could make it this morning. As was mentioned, I'm with Thomas Coon, Newton and Frost, a partner here. A lot of my legal work relates to representing vulnerable road users, including cyclists, pedestrians, and scooter riders in situations where they may have been injured as a result of some kind of interaction with another road user. I'm really proud of our law firm's long tradition of representing vulnerable road users. We've been doing that for several decades, and I've been doing that here since 2004. We've been really enthused and happy to partner with the Street Trust in the efforts to advocate for folks like you folks attending for a long, long time, and more recently with the WTA, and appreciate greatly their efforts both in East Portland, Central Portland, and Westside folks to make the roadway safer for vulnerable road users. So without further ado, what I hope to do this morning is present an overview of the rules of the road, and then at the end of the presentation, look at some photographs from the West Side and see how we might apply those rules to those photographs, which essentially present to us a situation with road usage. So the first thing I want to cover, and I'll go through these slides pretty quickly because I know that if I don't, we might run out of time. I really want to encourage you to ask questions, and my fellow panelists are going to keep an eye on those questions and let me know if you're asking a question so I can try to respond to it. But there are quite a number of statutes and rules that apply, and I want to see if we can get through them and get to those photographs. So I went on the Washington County site yesterday, and I was interested to see that on their recommendations for cyclists and other vulnerable road users, they basically pretty much tracked this list of things that I've been presenting for a long time. I thought that was pretty interesting. I didn't copy it here for you, but moving predictably when you're on the roadways and sidewalks is really important. Communicating clearly, super important. Staying visible, really important, and just watching out for everyone else who's using the areas that you're navigating in. Those principles are really important. And while there are rules these principles play really largely into being able to protect yourself on the road. On visibility, I really like these statistics from the ODOT pedestrian pamphlet that's been published. And this just emphasizes the importance of being visible. And this all relates to what we get involved in with collision reconstruction and a thing called perception reaction time. So whenever usually a vehicle fails to stop, there's always going to be a question if there's a collision about whether that vehicle had an opportunity to see the pedestrian or vulnerable road user and had time to stop. So this just shows you, and I'm not a math whiz, so I'm not going to crunch any of these numbers for you, but even wearing white as opposed to wearing black, whether or not you're wearing a reflective piece of clothing, really increases your visibility from a distance. And I bring this up because it's February and it's still really dark out when a lot of us are moving around. Even though we're not commuting as much, there's still plenty of people on the road in our dusk and dark hours. So really a great idea to incorporate some kind of white into your clothing if you can. One of my colleagues wears his old white baseball pants instead of black leggings to ride. So just emphasizing how important visibility is. Cyclists do have lighting requirements that are set forth in a statute, and whenever you see ORS here, that stands for Oregon Revised Statutes. The great thing about the internet is you can Google any of these rules and find these statutes pretty easily on your own. You can also find them in Ray Thomas's famous book, Pedal Power, which is easily found on our website, and those things are all outlined there. Lighting is required during limited visibility conditions. The white light has to be visible 500 feet, and the red light at the back of your bike visible 600 feet. Even though they're not required, lights can be very helpful to increase visibility during daytime. Several of the collisions that we've helped folks with occurred in daylight hours when folks were not seen by the driver. A couple of those involved dapple light, like riding through trees, like anywhere, like Shoals Ferry Road, or even residential streets in Hillsboro where there are large trees where there are moments of sunlight and moments of dark. That can be difficult for drivers, especially older drivers. And then again, bright contrasting clothing is always helpful. Here are some legal basics for you. The most important of those is that a bicycle is a vehicle, and that's set forth in ORS 814-400. And what that means is that bicycles are subject to vehicle laws. There are a couple exceptions to that. Sometimes statutes say except bicycles, and even if they don't say except bicycles, if there's a law that by its very nature can't apply to bikes, like some kind of exhaust rule or something like that, those statutes don't apply, but otherwise they do apply to a bike as a vehicle. Bike lanes are super important to we cyclists. And so the question is, what exactly is a bike lane? Here's a picture of one of them in downtown Portland. This is headed toward the Hawthorne Bridge. The bike lane here is painted green, but it doesn't need to be painted green to be a bicycle lane. And up at the intersection here, we have a bike box, which is not a bike lane. That's another feature of the roadway. This is the language from the statute, which just states, as you can see, that part of the highway adjacent to the roadway designated by official signs or markers for use by persons riding bicycles. So what happens with this is sometimes there are areas of the road that kind of look like a bike lane, but they're not marked as a bike lane, and so they are not then a bike lane. So here are a couple examples of some bike lanes. Like the one on the right is kind of interesting because the painted area is actually not a bike lane, it's just a buffer zone, and the bike lane is on the far right. So a lot of creativity as we see new infrastructure come in can be confusing to drivers who are having to understand that a variety of different markings on the roadway or signage might indicate a bike lane.
Cynthia, we do have one question in the
Uh-huh.
Dave was wondering if there were any laws pertaining to light brightness, maybe particularly for the front white light. Based on some experiences that Dave has had, it seems like maybe drivers have wondered about that. And do you have anything to say on that?
I guess what I would say about that is that according to this statute, these lights have to be the colors that they say, and they have to be visible at these distances. So the question would be, is that white light visible at 500 feet? I think would be the question, and the rear light visible from 600 feet. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I know that I mean, that's a really good point. The lights that you can buy vary greatly in their brightness, right? And then some of the lights, as your battery wears out, they get dimmer as well. So yeah, light maintenance and checking in our winter months is really important. Several years ago, the bike lane law got amended to hold that a bike lane exists in an intersection if the bicycle lane is marked on opposite sides in the same direction of travel. So this photograph shows a bike lane that is marked with hash marks and also a green box addition aspect to it in the middle of the intersection. But that is not required marking in order for a bicycle lane to continue through an intersection. All you need is a bike lane on one side of the intersection that continues on the other side of the intersection. And that became necessary because there were a couple of cases that held that folks turning across bicycle lanes within intersections were not violating the bicycle statute. So there was actually a legislative effort to get that done. This slide is just designed to point out the vast variety of different bicycle lanes that you find, which leads, I think, to driver confusion or lack of recognition of our rights in a bicycle lane. So on the left side, you can't see it, but there are bicycle markings on the roadway, and on the right side of that roadway, there is a marked bicycle lane. That's Broadway in downtown. And the cyclist here, just to jump ahead a little bit, there's a cyclist in the far left lane behind the FedEx truck. And in this particular circumstance, as I'll outline a little bit later, that cyclist is violating the law unless that cyclist is getting ready to turn or get off the roadway, because when there's a bicycle lane on the roadway, we're required to ride in the bicycle lane. And just to think about that a little bit more, I think that lines up with predictability, that when vehicle operators see bicycle lanes, they expect, or hopefully will expect, to see us there, but they may not expect to see us elsewhere. Here are some more bicycle lanes. On the left side, it's difficult to see that there's a marking on the roadway a little further ahead, but even if there weren't, this is a bicycle lane that has signage marking it, so this does qualify as a bicycle lane. And there's also a transit stop there involved, but the bicycle lane remains. And on the right side, pretty obviously, that's a marked bicycle lane. And that one even has hashing through the intersection, but again, that's not required because you can't see it, but there's a bicycle lane on the close side of that intersection as well. Occasionally, there are bicycle lanes on the left side of the road. Same rules apply. These pictures are just to point out the many different times when something might look like it might be a bicycle lane, but isn't a bicycle lane. So both of these are questionably bicycle lanes, probably not bicycle lanes because there's no bicycle marking on the roadway and there's no signage indicating that they're bicycle lanes. And sometimes bike lanes just end without any real indication of what you're supposed to do next. So this is the rule that I mentioned. Cyclists must ride in a bike lane when there is one, unless there's a good reason not to. So that would be something blocking the bike lane, debris in the roadway, or preparing to make a left turn. This is the cardinal rule that drivers must yield to riders on a bicycle lane, and that's 811-050. And that's a frequently cited statute in our work because right hooks and other bike lane intrusions are one of the biggest causes of bicycle vehicle collisions. I just threw these in because this is one of the attempts, the infrastructure attempts to avoid right hooks, where the bicycle gets a separate signal, which is here. Can you see my pointer as I move it? Anyone?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So these are the vehicle signals here. This is for the bike, and they're separated. My caution here for you is that is a pretty obvious one, which is sometimes drivers don't see these or don't pay attention to them because they are somewhat rarer and just not something folks are commonly, commonly see. So here the bike gets a green, and I apologize, this is kind of cut off, but the signal light for the traffic there is red. This is another infrastructure attempt to lessen the number of right hooks, essentially moving the bike lane over to the left and creating a vehicle right turn lane closer to the intersection. Here's a situation where the bicycle lane and the traffic lane merge so that the bicycle rider and the vehicle share the lane and hopefully are looking out for each other. Now, when there's no bike lane, interacting with traffic gets perhaps even trickier because I'm sure many of you have been in a situation where traffic's moving faster than you are. And then when you come to some kind of a stop, whether there's a stop sign or a light, you may end up moving faster than the traffic. But the general rule is that you need to ride as far to the right as practical. And on a one-way street, you can also ride to the left. You can, as we say, take the lane when you're overtaking or passing a vehicle, preparing to turn left, avoiding hazards or debris. And you can also ride two abreast, which a lot of people don't know. The key here is that you can't impede traffic. So it can be difficult, for example, in a residential street where the speed limit's 25, you're going between 20 and 25, and a car wants to go 30 or 35 and is coming up behind you. And that's just the difficult situation of really the car is violating the speed limit, but you're impeding their progress. So, that's kind of one of those things where technically they're in the wrong, but as a practical matter, you may want to move to the right so that you don't impede them, just as a practical measure. Bicyclists, because their vehicles didn't used to be able to overtake and pass a vehicle on the right, but with this statute that's, I want to guess 10 years old, I might be wrong about that, don't quote me on that. A bicycle can pass on the right, although it has to be safe to do so. And there are a number of situations, like at a four-way stop, where that can create a hazard because a vehicle coming from the right or the left might not see the cyclist as the cyclist passes alongside a line of stopped cars. Cars can pass cyclists, but only at a safe distance. And if the speed limit's greater than 35 miles an hour, they have to pass far enough away that if the cyclist were to fall, they wouldn't strike the cyclist. Car doors. The general rule about car doors is the car door opener has to ensure that the area they're opening the car door in is clear. And for us, the important part of that rule is clear for cyclists. You also can, it's possible to car door a door. It's also possible to car door a pedestrian. Car door a car, and you can also car door a pedestrian, but we're concerned about that as a vulnerable road user. And car door collisions can be remarkably dangerous. So as far as the statute goes, the cyclist here is in the right. However, insurance companies will sometimes argue that the cyclist is partly at fault based on arguments that they were not paying enough attention or that they were traveling too fast for conditions. So those can be really challenging situations. But we do have this car door statute. There's a lot of thinking about how to avoid this. And one of the interesting practical suggestions is to advocate that drivers open a driver's side door with the right arm. The other thing that's not shown on this slide is passenger car door situations, which are becoming more and more common with different roadway configurations. For example, bike lanes on the right side of parking lanes, and also with Uber and Lyft drivers letting folks out in various places in the roadway where it's unexpected. Sudden stop, they get out and there's a cyclist coming up behind, and that's becoming more and more of a problem. Crosswalks are super important and they are relatively dangerous. And the reason for that is because there's different folks moving in different directions at different speeds and trying to get across the roadway. So there are two kinds of crosswalks. One is a marked crosswalk and one is an unmarked crosswalk. And there's an unmarked crosswalk at every intersection or every corner. And I think the word on that is getting out pretty well. So what does that mean, that there's a crosswalk when it's marked, or there's a crosswalk at every corner? And what are the rules that folks have to follow? First of all, just to point out, there are lots of different versions of crosswalks. Here's a crosswalk in the middle of a block. And I say that because there's a roadway to the right, but there's not a roadway to the left. This is a T intersection. So mid-block crosswalks are even more challenging sometimes than marked crosswalks at corners and unmarked crosswalks at corners. And a lot of serious collisions that we've had have been at these mid-block crosswalks. So a vehicle operator must stop and remain stopped for a pedestrian when a pedestrian is crossing in a crosswalk. So here, even though this person who's crossing has a bike with him, this is a situation where the cyclist riding in the roadway has to yield to the walking cyclist because that person is a pedestrian. So then the question becomes, well, what does it mean when a pedestrian is crossing in a crosswalk? And the meaning of crossing the roadway in a crosswalk is in this slide, which is when any extension of the pedestrian, which includes a body, a wheelchair, a cane, a foot, a crutch or a bicycle, moves into the roadway in a crosswalk with the intent to proceed. So this pedestrian is arguably crossing the roadway in a crosswalk at this point. And this is a corner, so that's a crosswalk, it's unmarked, and this person's intending to proceed potentially. So arguably they're crossing. The counterpoint to that rule is that a pedestrian may not suddenly leave a curb or place of safety and move into the path of a vehicle that is so close as to constitute an immediate hazard. So in the legal world, this is how an adjuster or a defense attorney would argue that a pedestrian struck in a crosswalk is somehow at fault for that collision. This slide just deals with the fact that where crosswalks are signalized, where there's a pedestrian signal, that the vehicle is required to stop and allow another 6 feet of the adjacent lane before proceeding. So this tries to take care of the situation where you're crossing in a crosswalk, the vehicle has not come into the crosswalk to hit you, but is like so close to you when you're still in one lane that they need to wait until you get to the other lane. This is a really important rule because this is another dangerous situation. So when a vehicle is stopped at a crosswalk, the vehicles in the next lane must also stop. And the reason for that rule is maybe obvious, but it's because sometimes you cannot tell that there is a person crossing in the crosswalk when you're in that adjacent lane, and you must just assume that there is a person crossing, or you don't have to assume that, but you have to stop. And this is another situation that hopefully, none of you have experienced this too much, but I know I have, where you are proceeding to cross as a pedestrian and you're concerned about that empty lane at the far side because you're concerned that a car may come through there while you're crossing.
Cynthia, can I just jump in here really quickly?
Yeah.
In Washington County, there are a number of roadways where there's a fair amount of crossing to get from a sidewalk to a bus stop. And there's no marked crosswalk. There is technically a corner, but there have been instances where I've been in the left lane and I've stopped because I've seen a pedestrian, but the flow of traffic on that road is such that somebody might not assume that I'm stopping for a vehicle or for a pedestrian. They might think that I'm just, traffic in that lane has slowed down. So they'll buzz by on the right. And I have seen several instances where people have come within just feet of being nailed by a car. What do you do? I mean, how do you alert someone about that situation?
Right. Yeah, it's really tough. You wonder if you should be laying on your horn, or so is it a corner? So is that an unmarked crosswalk?
Yes. Yeah. So on one side, so it basically, it's like a T. So there's sort of a side street, and on the other side is a bus stop. And so people will stand at the corner on what would be my left side. And this is a one-way road, by the way.
Okay.
So people will stand on the left side. I'm in the left lane, and the bus stop is on the right. So people in the left lane will stop, and there's usually a pretty good crowd of folks who will cross over to get to the bus stop. But then traffic on the right lane can't see that because there's no other street on the other side. So it is kind of like a T. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So for the person who is, so you're in the left lane, are you going to have to turn right as well because the road's ending in front of you?
No.
Okay, so the road goes through, it's just the road, there's a road that comes in on the right, but on the left side, it's a T. It's a T over there.
There's a road that comes in on the left, but there's no road on the right.
Oh,
so
no
on
road on the right
side.
Okay,
yeah.
so the people in the right lane are going to be going straight.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult to know what you can do except tell a lot of people about this rule, because according to this rule, whether there's somebody crossing in that crosswalk or not, because you're stopped and it's a crosswalk, they have to stop. Yeah, I've been in that spot with you where you are stopped and you see the pedestrians are crossing and you're worrying about this fast traffic on your right or on your left that you can see moving through. Sometimes I put on my hazards, but I really don't know that there's anything else you can do. I mean, I guess you can honk, but it's really difficult.
Yeah, and I've done that, and I think sometimes pedestrians think I'm honking at them.
I know,
and they get freaked out.
Yeah, it's really difficult. That situation for sure.
Yeah, and Dave just
wish I could be more helpful.
No, that's fine. Dave put a comment in there, maybe move to the right lane. Unfortunately, when in that situation, I'm stopped and I can't move over to the right lane because the pedestrian's right in front of me and traffic is moving. So it is hard you're kind of stuck.
Yeah, I guess if you had a passenger in your car and you wanted to just go way above and beyond, they could roll down their window and like wave their hand or something. I mean, it is scary to watch a potential collision unfold like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is a rule that a lot of folks don't know, and seen people sort of criticize cyclists for riding in crosswalks. Cyclists may ride in crosswalks. The only rule that applies here is that when a cyclist is riding in a crosswalk, before they're riding in a crosswalk, if they're moving from the sidewalk to the crosswalk, they have to do that at ordinary walking speed. And I think there's some good rationale behind that, which is that when vehicles are trying to figure out if there's going to be somebody in the crosswalk, they're looking for somebody at the speed of a walking person entering the crosswalk. They're not looking for somebody who's going, you know, as fast as even a slow bicycle speed entering the crosswalk. So you got to enter at walking speed. This is one of our newest laws, Idaho Stop. I suspect a lot of you know about it. This allows cyclists to treat stop signs as yield signs, which means that cyclists still need to yield to any vehicle in an intersection or one approaching so close as to constitute an immediate hazard. And cyclists still have to yield to pedestrians in a crosswalk. That didn't change. Sidewalks. Bicyclists may ride on sidewalks in most places. In Portland, you can't do that between NATO and 13th and Hoyt and Southwest Jefferson. Pedestrians take precedence. So cyclists have to yield to pedestrians and must give an audible warning before passing them. The rule that I just stated about entering crosswalks at intersections applies to driveways on sidewalks. So in other words, when you're riding on a sidewalk, you have to enter and exit those driveway cuts at walking speed, which can make riding on a sidewalk less pleasurable than you might think, because there's so much slowing and accelerating. And electric bikes are not allowed on sidewalks. I did look over on the west side to try to locate statutes that might restrict riding in any of the downtown areas. And honestly, I could not find those, but if anyone from the west side knows about those and wants to either put it in the chat or let us know about that, I'd like to add that to my comments today, but I could not find any. I looked in Washington County and they didn't identify any of those. I had a sense that at one point there might be some areas of restriction, perhaps in downtown Beaverton. I just apologize that, you know, that's a possibility and I just don't have that addressed here. I don't know if you have a lot of these on the west side. I do want to mention these. These are called cross tracks. We've talked a lot about these here at the office, and not sure. I think the reviews on these are mixed. The reason why is because while this pedestrian crosswalk that is marked, that even if it wasn't marked would exist at this intersection, is there and provides crosswalk protections and rules. Crosstracks don't come with those protections and rules. So what a crosstrack basically does is say to drivers, in this area, you might expect more cyclists because this is a greenway and this greenway is now crossing a roadway, and you might see more bikes here. But it doesn't provide the cyclists riding in it with the crosswalk protections, and really honestly can be a little bit confusing. But we do have some of those here in Portland now. Here's another infrastructure thing that we have here, which is a 2-stage turn queue, which allows for making left turns by moving into these green protective boxes. It's pretty interesting to use it, and when there's a heavy traffic area, it can be really useful for making that left turn. Just wanted to point out cycle tracks. This is the example I talked about earlier with parking and the bicycle lane on the right-hand side. And you can see here, basically this illustration is showing about the possibility of a risk of a passenger car door event, although there is a buffer zone here that should help hopefully guard against that a little bit in this particular configuration. Quickly, e-bikes. This is the statutory definition of an e-bike. I won't read it to you. The most important thing about e-bikes is that e-bikes are not a motor vehicle, but the vehicle code applies to them just like bikes, just like it does to bikes. And you need to be 16-year-olds to ride an e-bike, and you can't ride it on the sidewalk. I do want to talk about collisions. I think this is really important. If you're involved in a collision, or if you see a vulnerable road user involved in a collision, it's really helpful if you gather some basic information. And I highlighted vehicle plate here because that's one of the key pieces of information that that we need if there's a collision and it turns out later that someone was hurt. So getting witness information, trying to take some photos with hopefully your cell phone that a lot of people have, getting the driver's license from the driver, but getting the plate, if everything else is difficult, can really lead to getting most of the rest of this information. And if you're a witness to a collision, it's really helpful if you leave some information about you, because you can be, it's really surprising how things might become important later. And it's really disappointing if someone did have information about it, but everyone kind of figured it wasn't going to be an issue, and so the information wasn't left. I want to go over a few things about insurance claims and legal action, just because more and more I find that people are not aware of this information, and it can really have major implications in what happens after any kind of collision. So if you are injured as a cyclist or a pedestrian in an event with a motor vehicle, the order of payment of your medical bills is going to be as follows. And this is like ironclad, it's got to go this way. The first payer is going to be the cyclist's own PIP coverage. That's personal injury protection under your auto coverage. And the next payer of medical bills is going to be your health insurance. And there is one more potential payer, and that is the driver's personal injury protection. And that order of payment of medical bills, and the fact that that exists, is not intuitive at all. And a lot of medical providers don't know that either. So when you go, for example, to the emergency room, that emergency room might start billing your health insurance if you're not aware to give them your auto insurance information. The other thing that PIP allows for, and again, this is going to be the Cyclist Pip, is covering 70% of your wage loss, so long as you are unable to work for a requisite number of days, which under most policies is 10 consecutive days. And you can get that wage loss paid like along the way, like as you are experiencing not being able to work. And then any additional wage loss that's not paid through personal injury protection can be included in what we lawyers call your bodily injury claim against the adverse driver. The third bullet point I added here, because that's the bodily injury claim, and that is made against the driver or the vehicle operator. And the reason I use the term vehicle operator here is because we have had some experience now with cyclist on cyclist injuries. And so if that happens to be the case, the at-fault cyclist might be able to provide compensation through homeowners insurance. The only way that's going to happen is if that other cyclist is identified. So again, going back to my earlier slide, it's important to get as much information at the scene as you can about who was involved, and some contact information about that from that person. Underinsured motorist coverage or uninsured motorist coverage, I think, is becoming more and more important. I don't know if it's a product of COVID or not, but in the last couple of years, we have seen, I would say, an increasing number of people who are seriously injured by vehicle operators who are either uninsured or grossly underinsured. And in order to mitigate against that, uninsured motorist coverage and underinsured motorist coverage of higher limits on the cyclist's own auto policy are super helpful. And I'll just give two examples. We helped a woman who was struck from behind on Highway 1. The gentleman who struck her was uninsured and unlicensed, and she had multiple fractures. But she had a very high uninsured motorist limit of $500,000. And so that was really helpful to her in obtaining compensation and covering her medical expenses related to these multiple fractures and her long hospitalization. And had she not had that, or had she had Oregon minimal limits of $25,000 on her uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage, it would have been a really, really challenging situation for her. That is contrasted with another person that we are trying to help, who was struck by an out-of-state insured driver who has a $25,000 bodily injury limit. And she had extremely serious injuries requiring at least 6 weeks hospitalization, but she has more modest uninsured, underinsured motorist limits. And so that's going to affect the coverage of her medical expenses and her financial compensation really significantly. So it's not hard to check with your auto insurer about what your insurance limits are and see what the additional cost is to increasing uninsured motorist coverage and increasing PIP coverage. And this is something that the carriers often don't bring up with their insureds, because candidly, the insurers make the most money providing what Oregon people will often call full coverage, meaning I have some bodily injury coverage, I have underinsured motorist coverage, I have PIP. They're required to write $15,000, but they don't make nearly as much money when you call them and say, I want to increase my PIP limits to $50,000, or I want to increase my PIP limits to $25,000. That can be done at a really low cost. In fact, I was speaking with a colleague the other day who said she was able to increase her UIM and her PIP for both of them to the next level for like $100 a year. So it's really something worth looking into with some of these really serious collisions that we're seeing caused by un- and underinsured motorists. I know I spent quite a bit of time on that, but it's just becoming such a big issue for our cyclists that I wanted you to all know about it. If your health insurance pays for some of your medical expenses related to a collision and you file a claim and you make a recovery, almost every health insurer is going to have a subrogation or reimbursement clause in the policy that allows them to get paid back. And if your health insurance is through an ERISA plan, those payback provisions can be very aggressive. The
Cynthia,
next bullet.
I'm sorry, we had a question here about from Max. He asked, what do you do if you don't carry auto insurance?
Right. If you don't have auto insurance, you don't have these benefits. And there's been a lot of talk over the years about there being an insurance company that would insure cyclists. I honestly don't know if there's a company out there right now that's doing that. If there ever have been those, they've been far and few in between. So that is something to be aware of, and be aware of how that will affect you if you are in a collision, meaning you hopefully then have health insurance, and you hopefully will be involved with an event, collision with a driver who has Oregon coverage and does at least have that PIP coverage to help cover the medical expenses that your health insurer does not pay.
Max followed up. He said, what about renter insurance?
Renter's insurance ordinarily will exclude you from, will exclude coverage for automobile involved events, which means that if you're in a collision with another vehicle, that coverage is probably not going to cover you. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough for cyclists who don't have auto insurance.
We also had a raised hand. Chris, do you want to, here, I'll click the allow to talk if you wanted to add something.
Well, I was just wondering about the people who don't have driver's licenses with disabilities. I mean, how are they supposed to get around the community if their mobility device doesn't fit on a standard bus or fit in the bike lane or on the bike rack? And they're kind of stuck out in the middle of nowhere.
Right, are you talking about in terms of their relation, their being a driver or them just getting around?
Well, in general, you know, like tricycles don't fit on buses. Tricycles don't fit on MAX trains. You know, a lot of the electric assist vehicles are now being excluded from access to the community because electric bikes are considered vehicles where electric assisted mobility device is going to be more or less like a adaptive wheelchair that's maybe a little faster, a little bit different than other things. And so how do those people fit into the system? Because right now they're kind of a third wheel, you know, the cog out there. There's not a bike rack around to accommodate three-wheelers. There's not a bus around that could accommodate a guy on a hand cycle. You know, and yet we have a lot of people with disabilities here that, you know, they're kind of stuck.
Yeah, it is super tough, and it's probably even tougher in COVID. If this device is a bicycle, then it's going to get these bike lane protections, and you're going to be able to get around in those places, and you can ride, you know, you can operate those on the sidewalk if they're not, you know, if they're not e-bike motorized. But in terms of them interfacing with public transportation and those kind of things, it's super challenging. And I know that that's one of the things that both of the organizations that are sponsoring this today are really concerned about, is access to transportation across the board, and, you know, advocating for those people who are on the edges of our system and for whom our systems make it even more challenging to get around.
Well, a bike lane is actually, the other legal user of a bike lane is a person in a wheelchair, providing they have a tail light. And so with the new technologies, they have hand cycle attachments that clip right onto the front of your bike, onto the front of your manual wheelchair. And then they have hand cycles that have electric motor attachments to them that give you that assistance so that you could get home. All of these things are kind of like a hybrid wheelchair bicycle. And, you know, where do they fit? Because the definition of a bicycle actually could have three wheels. So, you know, the system seems to be behind the times.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you on that. And thanks for your question, Chris. It's a very relevant question. So the next bullet point here is the recorded statement. And the reason I highlight that is, if you're in a circumstance where you're injured, when ultimately an insurer is going to call you and ask you for a recorded statement about how that all happened. And that's a good time to consider whether or not you want to go that alone, whether you want to go your claim alone, or whether you want to get some assistance. And the reason for that is because that recorded statement is your description of how it happened. It's not a deposition, but it's going to end up being really important in the insurance companies starting to make what we lawyers call liability determinations, which is basically their preliminary thinking about who's at fault. And so that is going to be recorded, it's going to be transcribed, and it's going to maybe not get etched in stone, but it's going to get etched. And so if you are at that point, you know, unless it's something that's a really obvious collision, that's a good time to think about getting someone to help you with it. And, you know, our office or any other office, you know, worth its salt is going to be willing to talk to you on the phone about generally, how did this happen? Is this the kind of situation where it's probably something you can handle on your own, or something that you would be better off to have some help with? And if you're going to do that, now is a good time, because the lawyer can sit with you and prepare you for that recorded statement to get liability headed in the right direction from the very start of your claim. Filing deadlines in Oregon, 2 years from the date of the collision, unless it's a governmental entity that's involved, which is a pretty rare circumstance. That's a 180-day tort claim notice. Many of these situations will settle without the case needing to be filed, and that ordinarily happens, you know, between about 6 months to between 6 months in front of the statute and the statute date. So that's how those legal claims work out. I just really wanted to go over some of those insurance ideas with you today and information. Let's look at some of your photos. I'm going to work to bring those up. I appreciate having these. These are nice Westside scenes, and they're just going to raise the things we've been talking about. Let's see, can I make this bigger? Yeah. Okay. So this is Beaverton, and you know, this is a one-way road. It's got a bike lane. We know that if there's a bike lane on the other side of this intersection, that the bike lane continues through the intersection. We don't have a traffic lane to the right here. We've got parking. We've got the car door interface issue back behind here. This is a situation where I can't tell if this is signalized or not, but once traffic stops in any of these lanes, the traffic in the other lane must also stop, and that includes this bicyclist. So I don't know if anyone who provided these photos had a particular question about the rules that apply in a certain situation, or maybe something that happened at one of these, but if so, Maddie or Julia, just raise your hand and let me know, and I'll try to address that. But those were my thoughts about what's kind of in play in this particular location.
Yeah, I think it's just nice to have a reference of what bike lanes might look like outside of downtown Portland, particularly in Washington County. So these are great examples.
Good, good. Here's a great example of bike traffic lane merging. So you have a sharrow on the road here, or a bike lane marking on the road here, but it's right in the middle of the lane. And you can tell that this is also going to be available for vehicles. So this is a point of navigation between cyclists and motor vehicles. It's pretty short, a little short stretch here. I could see issues coming up where with the cyclist taking the lane here and motorists be concerned that the cyclist is impeding traffic. Looks like if this cyclist is going to follow the bike route, this is going to be a pretty short piece, and there'll be a left turn involved. But again, this is a shared roadway situation, and those are always challenging because you have two modes, you know, coming together, whether you have a pedestrian with a vehicle coming together or you have a bike and a vehicle coming together. Those are always moments for extra attention and, you know, hopefully accommodation with each mode of transportation, so folks can get through here safely without too much frustration.
I have a question actually. So in this scenario where the sharrow is in the center of the lane, there isn't a separate bike lane, it would be appropriate for the cyclist to stay in the center of the lane and not stay as far to the right as possible. Is that how you use this section?
Yeah, so the general rule is that you need to stay as far to the right as practical, and except you can take the lane if you're not impeding traffic, which basically means that yes, if you're not impeding traffic, you can ride down the center of this roadway.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah. So this is a bike lane on the right. cyclists required to ride in the bicycle lane. Does point out, you know, it's a good reminder that there are large vehicles out there. Also a good reminder that where there are buses and presumably bus stops on the other side of this bicycle lane, that buses and cyclists are going to be navigating with each other to let that bus come over and presumably stop and then cross back over the lane to get back out in traffic. So that is another hazard, you know, another challenging situation. The bus is required to yield to the rider on the bicycle lane, even if they're moving over to the stop. And, you know, the cyclist just has to be aware that sometimes these buses are pretty aggressive about moving over to drop off the passengers. And it is a tension because, you know, the cyclist is impacting the other vulnerable road users' use of the roadway because these are passengers on a bus who also want to get where they're going. But it's in the form of a vehicle, and the vehicle has to yield to the cyclist in the bike lane. Here's Forest Grove. Here's another bicycle lane on a one-way street. Cyclists required to ride in the bicycle lane. We got some faded paint here, not an uncommon situation. And here we have a bus stop and potentially parked cars taking up this curb area. So you've got the bus challenge here as well as the potential car door issue further up the road. Here are cyclists riding on a sidewalk. We know that's fine as long as they're entering and exiting at walking speed. This is an interesting sidewalk because this sidewalk has actually been specially marked for bicycles to ride on, I believe. I can't tell because of this bush. I'm kind of assuming that this is the other direction bike lane coming down this way. And maybe some of you in Washington County can say something about this, but I am thinking perhaps this was designed because out in this roadway, there wasn't enough room, or there was concern about, you know, there wasn't enough room to make a bike lane, or there was concern that traffic in this area is such that even if there were a bike lane here, it would be too challenging for cyclists. So they just put them up on the sidewalk and did some special sidewalk markings. This slide raises some questions about the direction that you should travel in a bike lane. There's no specific statute that says you must ride in the bike lane in the direction of travel. But if you combine statutes, it's a reasonable inference that when you're riding in a bicycle lane that you are to be going in the direction of travel of that bicycle lane. And so these kiddos here are going the wrong way. As a practical matter, unless it's a two-way designated cycle track situation, it can be really challenging even for cyclists if other cyclists are going essentially the wrong way in the bike lane. On this road, you know, this isn't, I don't even know that this is a two-lane road. Maybe this is yellow line, but at any rate, best practice, ride in the direction of travel in the bike lane, and perhaps required by statute.
Cynthia, this raises another question in Washington County, as really all over the Portland metro area. We're seeing lots of unhoused folks with bicycles. Many often will ride in whichever direction they're heading, irrespective of bike lanes or traffic patterns. What happens in a situation like that if there's an accident? How does that factor into this conversation?
That is going to be a really tough situation. In terms of this, let's say the cyclist who is the housed person is injured. there's going to be a huge question whether how that person's medical bills will get paid. So likely your auto PIP is not going to cover you then. And so the first payer of medical bills is going to be your health insurance. And that's going to end up probably being the only payer, because the houseless person, if they had auto insurance, that auto insurer is likely not going to cover that claim. And so if that were a housed person and you knew who that person was, you could inquire with them about renters or homeowners insurance, and they wouldn't have any PIP coverage there, but they potentially would have liability coverage to compensate you. So I hope I'm answering your question, but so what would happen for the person hurt? They would have to use their health insurance to, recover their medical expenses and use any avenues to covering income loss that they might have through their employer, like a short-term disability policy if they were seriously injured or those kind of things. But the avenues for recovery are super limited / non-existent in that circumstance.
Thank you. I think it's just a reminder that a lot of the scenarios that we're seeing now, we have an added variable with more and more folks out on the road, and particularly folks who are using bikes as transportation and who may not be aware of or cognizant of what we're talking about today. So just, I guess, a reminder to be extra cautious, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And, we talk a lot about, for example, visibility. So visibility, hoping that if we're more visible, others will see us, and not only see us, but take appropriate action. But what I feel like more and more is that being visible is really not enough, because you have to be extra vigilant is what is, I think, as important as being more visible, because you need to be, in that circumstance, to avoid what we just talked through. The housed cyclist needs to try to keep that from happening as much as they can, because if it happens, first of all, you don't want to be hurt. You don't want that to happen. You don't even want the houseless person to be hurt. They could also be hurt in that. But there are just much more limited recoveries in some of these situations, so that you just want to do everything you can to keep these things from happening in the first place. The other thing your question makes me think about is the increased use of bicycle lanes by non-cyclists. And I've come to understand through representing several people that people are using bicycle lanes to socially distance in walking situations. So people are leaving the sidewalk when encountering another pedestrian on a sidewalk to allow for social distancing, and entering bike lanes at unpredictable times, and walking in bike lanes, treating them as sidewalks and walking facing traffic, which is safe for them, but puts them in a position where we may not expect to find them, either as cyclists or as motorists. So I guess what I'm saying is, right now, some of the rules of the road are being flexed because of COVID, because of either people being, houseless people being in them, people not understanding what they're for, and people using them for reasons that they were not intended to be used for. So it's gotten more complicated out on the roadways for sure. If you folks, if we run into a time crunch, just let me know. But I'm just going to continue to tick through these photos unless you let me know that we should wrap up, okay?
Yeah, I pasted the link to the book in the chat. So if you're available to keep talking, everyone who can stay, please do so, and we'll continue learning.
Okay, all right, great. This is Hillsboro. Some of you probably recognize this. I think this is a pretty highly traveled area. I don't know a lot more to say about this, except, again, this looks like it's a signal, but if this was not a signalized intersection, once these folks stop at this crosswalk, all the lanes have to stop. And that might be one of the main points here. Nice to see this person helmeted if they're going to travel in this kind of a higher speed traffic area. Probably don't need to say, a concussion is one of the worst things that can happen. And helmets really help prevent that. So a big helmet fan. Here's a good example of several things. First of all, we have potentially a COVID era usage of the area along the side of the road by a couple of pedestrians who are walking along here. You probably all are now looking, because you've been all primed on this, to try to figure out, is this a bike lane? Well, there's a mark on the ground up here, but I don't think that's a bike. So, and I don't see a sign. So unless there's one of those things within a few feet this way or somewhere soon, this is probably a shoulder and not a bike lane, which means you're perfectly free to ride in it as a cyclist, but you're not going to get your 811 050 yield to a rider in a bicycle lane protection on this area of this roadway.
I think that is a bike lane. That's on Barber Boulevard. I recognize that. I think it is. It's awful. It's the worst thing ever, but I think it is a bike lane.
Okay, fair enough. Here's an intrepid cyclist out in lots and lots of traffic. Can't tell if they're helmeted, would sure be a good idea. We got a bike lane going through an intersection here, whether or not marked, because I believe this is a bike lane over here on the other side. I don't know what more to say about this, except this is obviously a higher speed, higher traffic situation where probably would be enhanced by higher visibility clothing. And lots of paying attention needed in this circumstance. Here is what looks like what I would call a rapid flashing beacon crosswalk. Whether or not this person activates this signal, this cyclist as a vehicle is required to stop and yield for this person who appears to be a pedestrian preparing to cross within a crosswalk. This person is not at this point really likely to be within the law if they were to just walk out, because this vehicle is potentially close enough that it would constitute an immediate hazard. But this vehicle is supposed to yield. And this cyclist is not wearing high vis clothing and does not appear to have any lights activated. So again, lighting not required in this circumstance, but would make the cyclist much more visible. Here's our tricycle using a bike lane, which should be, well, we don't know it's a bike lane, but it appears to be a bike lane. And I would expect that there are markings and signs on either side of this photograph. This bicycle is legal in this bicycle lane. I don't even see that it's an e-assist, but even if it were, so long as it was within the power restrictions, it would be legal. So that's a nice alternative to have in our mix. And this is the last photo I have. And again, just a few of the same questions. Is this a bicycle lane? Looks like it well could be, but I can't determine that from this photograph. Coming up to what looks like a crosswalk. Again, no helmet not required, but helpful. Not a lot of high vis clothing. Not required, but helpful. And I don't see any lights on, again, not required, but helpful, even in these daylight conditions, especially along what is a pretty busy road of TV highway. All right, let's see what else I have. Oh, I just leave you with this photo and reminder that I love, which is that, you know, sometimes we're on our bike and sometimes we're driving and sometimes we're on a bus and sometimes we're walking. And that, you know, behind or inside every one of those things you might see on the roadway, there's a person. And it's really important that we all keep in mind that we need to share the road, especially in these challenging COVID times. And that's all I got, unless there are any questions.
Thanks so much. I was actually poking around because I too was curious about if your headlights when you're on a bicycle can be too bright, and it definitely looks like there's nothing about that, although there are for car headlights rules about how they must be aimed. So I imagine that might also be very hard to measure, but applicable to bicycles.
Right. And I know that there are some people who don't like the flashing ones, especially if they're flashing at that really high, bright level. And, you know, I think that there's some question whether having it flashing gives you a lot more than what you have when it's not flashing. So, you know, it doesn't need to be flashing. And I think the jury's out on whether or not the flashing gives you a lot more benefit. One thing we didn't say that gives you a lot more benefit, if you receive complaints or you want to tone down the brightness of your front light, is adding other light elsewhere. You know, adding some kind of white clothing and then adding something on your wheel or something on your pedals, or there are so many different lighting options now. I mean, I'm sure some of you have seen like the amazing like kaleidoscope ones that people put on their wheels, and you can get pretty elaborate, but without even too much cost, you can add something somewhere else on your bike that, you know, enhances your visibility, and you can still meet that front and rear lighting requirements.
Thank you. Bob, do you want to remind everyone about the next program, timing and subject?
I do. I'm going to post a link in the chat. So it'll be next Saturday at 10 o'clock. It's the Oregon Friendly Driver class, and there's a link to register in the chat. If you miss this, you can also visit the Forest Grove City Library website and go to the events calendar, and we have it posted there as well. So 10 o'clock next Saturday morning, and we hope to see you all there.
That is a fun class for people who ride bikes and walk as well. There's some overlap with this class, much more fascinating, driver specific, and a test at the beginning and end too. So I quite like Oregon Friendly Driver, and I do not drive.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. And then I guess maybe once we receive the recording of this, we can share it with people as needed.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, WTA, and Bob in the library. Bye.
All right. We'll see you
Bye.
next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.